This is William and Lonsdale, a podcast about the legal ecosystem and the fascinating people who make it tick. Today, your host, Michael Green, speaks with criminal lawyer Tania Wolff. Tania currently holds a number of positions in our legal community, including Director of First Step Legal, Sessional Member of the Mental Health Tribunal, Treasurer and Executive Member of the Law Council of Australia, immediate past President and ongoing Director of the Law Institute of Victoria, and to top it off, since we recorded this episode, Tania has become a member of VCAT. Like her current portfolio, Tania's career has been broad, involving myriad roles both in and outside the law, even taking up an offer to become a legal recruiter at one point, which didn't quite work out as she planned.
And for whatever reason, I said, well, that would be a great idea, and I joined a legal recruitment firm for a while. And when I say for a while, it was really for a blink. I worked out pretty soon afterwards that was not the route for me, and I was really quite terrible at it. There's very few things that I've done in my life which I've been an abject failure at, but I would say legal recruitment was that. And I lasted 3 months, and I remember being walked out of the building, which was the way they used to do it at the time, so that you wouldn't steal, I guess, client lists and what have you. I remember walking out of that Collins Street office and walking up and down Collins Street thinking, oh dear, 25 years old and I'm all washed up.
Our guest this morning on Lives in Law is Tania Wolff. Good morning, Tania.
Good morning, Michael.
Tania, you've got a long and interesting story to tell, but currently, and for the last, 10 or 11 years, you've been a director of a practice called First Step Legal. Can you tell us what that is, what First Step Legal is and what it does? We'll go into full detail later, but I'd just like to sort of set the scene and know what it is, because it's not a typical practice.
No, you're right about that. So I started not as director of it. I started as a lawyer joining what was a very unusual and still is quite an unusual legal practice. It's both a CLC, which is a community legal centre, and it's also a health justice partnership. And First Step Legal is unusual in a number of respects, but it's a legal service that's embedded within a mental health and addiction clinic in St Kilda. And as you know, we can speak about health justice partnerships in more detail, but essentially it's where you have a cooperation or a collaboration between legal practices or a legal practice and legal professionals and health professionals or health practices. And the reason for doing that is to be able to effect better access to justice and responses for people who are engaged with the criminal justice system or justice system generally. And
have a mental health issue as well?
Well, in this situation, absolutely. So First Step itself is a clinic in St Kilda. It has doctors, it has mental health practitioners, it has psychologists who work there. There's a specific program that deals with addiction matters. And so people come there with a variety and a complexity of problems and issues. And the idea of health justice partnerships really is to bring law or legal support to people where they are. Often people with complexity don't go to see a doctor they certainly would. They may see a doctor if they absolutely need to, but they'll rarely get the help that they need in the variety of ways that they need it. And most likely they won't go to see a legal practitioner to assist them with legal issues until the very last minute, until the day of court, if they're, in court for a criminal justice matter and they're speaking to legal aid on the day. So this is a way of being able to more holistically respond to problems which, when they're not responded to, become more significant and result in other problems and other conditions, both health and legal. And so it's a much more of a holistic response to complexity.
Thank you for that. And we'll get back to that and talk about that in greater detail later. But let's go back to the beginning. Your family came to Australia pre- and post-Second World War.
Yes.
Who were they? How was that? Was it parents, grandparents?
So my mother's parents, and my mother was born overseas. My mother was born in Romania, and she and her family came to Australia after the Second World War. She spent a number of the war years in a displaced persons camp in Italy before coming to Australia with her family. My dad's family, as you know, most of the Melbourne Jewish community came around the Holocaust. So my dad's family started in Germany. So they were very fortunate to leave Germany in 1938. My grandmother at the time, my paternal grandmother at the time, was studying medicine, and she wanted to finish her degree in medicine before she left. Her parents left to what was at the time called Palestine just before the war, and she stayed to finish her medical degree. And fortuitously, in 1938, my paternal grandfather heard about this young doctor in Germany, and he called her and invited her for a coffee, and they had a coffee together. And over a couple of cups of coffee, he said to her that he has a visa, 2 visas actually, to get to Australia, and asked her if she would marry him and come to Australia at the time. And it was an extraordinary turn of events, but my grandmother agreed. I think she once told me that she went to his house afterwards and met his mother, and they were having a cup of tea together, and she was watching how he was responding to his mother, talking to his mother and acting towards his mother, and she thought, well, if he is good with his mother, there's a good chance he'll be good with me. And they came to Australia at the time.
What an amazing story. What an amazing story. So let's get to Australia. You're born here, grew up southern suburbs of Melbourne, and went to Mount Scopus, both primary school and secondary school.
Yes. So for a number, my grandparents obviously had come from Europe, and one of the responses of the Melbourne community, and particularly the Melbourne Jewish community, which had been forged after the Second World War, was the importance of community and the importance of rebuilding. And so I guess the idea of my grandparents were pioneers in setting up, or not so much setting up, but sending their child to Mount Scopus College. So my father was one of the first that went to Mount Scopus College, and myself and my brother, we went for 12 years. And it was very much about the response to what had happened in the Holocaust, the response to the Nazi regime and to Hitler was thriving, and a community that was knitted, and the community that stuck together, and a culture that endured.
In about year 10, you decide you want to be a lawyer.
Yes.
Can you think of an event that triggered that?
Well, I think I had been remotely interested in it for some time, a couple of reasons. I mean, there's a saying with a lot of Jewish families that if you have a child and they're bright, you encourage them to do medicine. If they're slightly slow, there's always law. And I was probably in the slightly slow category. I think I was also one that liked argument, and I liked debating, and I was in plays, and around that time people said, oh, you might be good at law, or law might be an option for you as well. And I was sitting next to the niece of the late Ron Caston in class, and she had said to me...
Can I say, just to clarify for people who may not know, he was a leading QC at the Victorian and Australian bar really for decades.
Absolutely. And people have heard of Marbo, I'm sure. He was the lawyer the barrister that brought that extraordinary case to the High Court and was successful in relation to it. But she had suggested that maybe I could do work experience, which was a day or two in a law practice, and I could do it with the late Ron Caston. And although he won't remember that day, or wouldn't have remembered that day at all, it made a huge impression on me. I think spending a couple of days with he, and it was Aitken Chambers, I think, at the time, but it was otherwise more informally referred to as the Golan Heights, because you had the late Ron Caston, you had late Alan Goldberg, Ron Merkel was there, a couple of others, John Middleton, I think, and Cliff Panderman. And it was an extraordinary sort of bunch of lawyers that talked to each other, that they were very collegiate, and there was a real energy about the place, not only the issues that they'd talk about, but just there was a feel about it that I couldn't really put my finger on. But at the end of it, I thought, this just sounded wonderful, and it was something that I really wanted to do.
So you go to Monash, late 80s, early 90s. You made the comment that you're a bit of a tourist at university.
Yes.
Can you explain that to us, please?
Well, I think a couple of reasons, really. Although I did enjoy the legal subjects that I did, and I do have some memory of criminal law and evidence, I was there not very frequently. I felt that I did my majoring in waitressing when I was in university rather than in the law. I moved out of home when I was 18 and I worked full-time in a whole lot of different respects. I've worked every day as a waitress in different cafes, and I also worked in other respects. So I worked for, at the time, something called AIP, which was Australia-Israel Publications. It was a publication that was focused on explaining the Middle East to potentially, to the community and the complexities of it, which is important to do because it is a very fraught area in a complex region. And when I joined AIP at the time, it was during the Iraq War, and Scuds were raining on Tel Aviv, and we were trying to explain to the media here and to the community what was going on and some of the complexities of the long-standing issues in the region. And from there, I also then went to Washington, D.C. for a short period of time. And
this is part of your tourist activity.
This is part of my tourist activity. I worked with the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and it was actually an extraordinary time because it was, at the time, it was 1990 then, which some of your listeners might know was at the time that there was a peace process happening, which President Clinton was very much involved in and coordinated. And it was the historic handshake between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin on the lawns of Washington, D.C. And it was a time when there was extraordinary hope. Well, I felt an extraordinary hope for peace in the region, which, given recent events, is sad to reflect on. But at the time, I was very much feeling that there was a change about to happen. There were bilateral negotiations, there were multilateral negotiations, and it was a fascinating time to be involved in this area.
So while conducting your tourist activities, you actually did manage to get a BA and an LLB.
Yes, somehow.
And to line up articles with Arnold Bloch-Leibler.
Yes.
Did you do your articles?
Well, not immediately. So there's more tourism ahead. I was very lucky. They allowed me to defer my articles for a year because I did want to travel again. And apart from sort of the Israel area and sort of Israel advocacy and Middle East area that I was involved in beforehand, I think my focus was also very much on the world and how it had changed. I had been lucky enough to be backpacking around Europe in 1989. And that was when the wall came down, the Berlin Wall came down, and I was jumping up and down around the wall, and had gone the week afterwards to Prague when Havel was elected, and again, very excited to be running around and dancing around the Jan Palach Memorial. So I was very keen to travel some more. But I didn't have more than the ability to get somewhere with an airfare, and I thought, well, where should I go? And I heard that Korea was somewhere where not many people had gone to, and it was new and novel, and I might be able to try and get a job teaching English in Korea. And I was able to secure a visa to get there by an agreement to work in a foreign language high school in Seoul, and off I went.
I find that intriguing because I assume you spoke no Korean.
No Korean at all.
How do you teach English as a second language to people when their first language is Korean and they don't speak English, and your first language is English and you don't speak Korean?
With some difficulty. So I didn't actually also, I'm embarrassed to say, I didn't know much about Korea at all, because on the plane on the way there, and I knew where it was, somewhere around Asia, there was a war sometime sort of around the 50s, and that was all I knew, and I didn't speak any Korean. Luckily, the language itself is very phonetic. So if you learn the alphabet, which I did on the plane, you can sort of read without necessarily understanding the language, which I did over time. But what is really extraordinary about Korea is that the young people and everyone learns English from a very young age. They learn it the grammar, and they learn it from when they are in sort of kindergarten or the equivalent. And it is important for them to know it because their exams all require proficiency in English in written form. The big thing about Koreans, though, was that they didn't want to lose face, and speaking it was something entirely different. So most of what I had to do was to give them confidence and give my students confidence to speak and to try their hand at it, because most of the time they could understand what was being said if I said it slowly and without too much of a strong Australian accent. But being able to communicate was tricky. So that's what I did. And it was an exciting time.
How long were you there for?
I was there in the end for about 2.5 years, which was not the plan, but I arrived there and it was one of those extraordinary adventures. Such a different culture, such a different life. People were so kind and so welcoming. There's a real benefit if you're a teacher in a Confucianist-based society, because there's so much respect for you. And so I was welcomed. The way in which you are treated the way I was treated was extraordinary. I didn't live in a Western area. I lived within sort of a home in Seoul, and I rented an area of it. But I wasn't near the American base, which is where so many of the Westerners usually focused their time and spent time. And as a result of it, I had a complete immersion in Korean society, and I loved it. And so I spent a lot more time there, and I got a whole lot more work. I started my days very early. I ended up teaching a lot of the what they call chaebol, the major corporations of Hyundai, Kia, and I would teach classes for some of the working people in the morning early. Then I would go to school and teach the rest of the students. Then after school, so many of the students go to further study groups because there's such a pressure to succeed and to get into universities, and so they go to further study, and I was teaching till quite late at night. So I love that. I even did a rather cheesy cable TV show in English. But yes, I was able to do it even though I didn't speak Korean, but it was wonderful. It was really just an extraordinary experience, and I loved it. It really enriched my life.
So Tania, throughout this 2.5 years in Korea, your articles are hanging in limbo, so to speak.
Yes.
What brought you back?
The idea that they wouldn't be hanging in limbo anymore was a pretty strong response. But, ABL had been very generous in giving me that additional time. And then I came back and I thought, well, I'm going to start the new chapter in my life, which would be in the law. And I came back to do my articles a year afterwards.
You did your articles for a year, but then you didn't take the traditional route of remaining with the firm or going to another firm and continuing into legal practice. You followed a different path.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that path, please?
Sure. It is a bit circuitous, but I went to go and speak to a recruiter to just find out what the options are, a legal recruiter, in terms of the law. I was always interested in sort of a broader vista, and I didn't see myself, as one ought to be sometimes when they start in a legal practice, as anyone further up the hierarchy. I couldn't imagine myself in that position, even if it was a corner office. I couldn't really see myself that way through. So I went to speak to a recruiter about, what are the options? And the recruiter said to me, well, we think, after speaking to you a few times, we think you'd be great to work with us because you like people, or there was some kind of a personality that they detected in me that would make me great for helping people find their role in the law. And for whatever reason, I said, well, that would be a great idea. And I joined a legal recruitment firm for a while. And when I say for a while, it was really for a blink. I worked out pretty soon afterwards that was not the route for me, and I was really quite terrible at it. There's very few things that I've done in my life which I've been an abject failure at, but I would say legal recruitment was that. And I lasted 3 months, and I remember being walked out of the building, which was the way they used to do it at the time, so that you wouldn't steal, I guess, client lists and what have you. And I remember walking out of that Collins Street office and walking up and down Collins Street thinking, oh dear, 25 years old, and I'm all washed up. Nowhere to go, nothing to do. I've sort of burnt my bridge with the law because I left a great law firm. What am I going to do next? And I guess life had different plans for me at the time, because I went back to sort of working odd jobs, which I did do for a while, and I went back to waitressing, which I've always been very good at. And I did some personal development work, which was probably helpful. But through that, I met this fellow who was teaching and lecturing at quite an unusual legal program at Deakin University. It was the Curry Institute legal course, and it was specialised in providing, the program for Indigenous law students. And he spoke to me about whether or not I might want to help him with tutoring a number of the subjects and providing some lecturing support in other subjects. And I thought that was quite interesting because, as mentioned beforehand, I'd not been such a fabulous student. But he assured me that I would be up for the task, and I gave it a go. And I did feel like a bit of a fraud. I felt a little bit like, that's that expression that those who can't do teach. I thought I was a living embodiment of it. But I loved it and I enjoyed it. And that experience was so important for me because it also gave me confidence that maybe I could stick in this law game in some way or another. I felt more confidence because I ended up learning a little bit more about some of the subjects that I'd somehow scraped through at university, and the experience itself was really satisfying.
So 2 years at Deakin?
It might have been, about 2 years, maybe 1.5 years. And after that, I remember I thought, well, I'm going to go back to a recruiter and find out what options there might be. This time
a different recruiter.
A different recruiter, and this time I was very certain that and very clear about the fact that I'd tried that and that was not going to be an option going forward. I certainly didn't have a sales bone in my body. So I spoke to a recruiter, and I remember this lady because she was really encouraging, and she said, well, you might be interested in in-house counsel work. Of course, I knew nothing about in-house counsel work, but she said that, I might enjoy it. And she had an option that was a short-term contract working with a company called Pasminco at the time, which was a lead and zinc mining company. And so, I went for the interviews. I didn't think I could manage it, but somehow I got through, and I started to work with the legal counsel at the time in Pasminco. I did that for a number of months. And it was through that again, my confidence increased, and I tried something new, and it was interesting and it was different. And I love being part of a company. I love being part of a team where they would come and speak to you and you could provide some assistance. And so I thought, well, this is okay. And, in those days we used to get a hard copy newspaper, and I remember flicking through the weekend paper and seeing the ads. And there was another ad in the paper that caught my eye, and it was to work for a company called Caverna. And this time, not on the client side of the equation, but on the employer side of the equation, which was to work for a contracting company, an engineering and construction contracting company, a Norwegian one. And I remember looking at the ad, and it had all of these aspects to it. It was understand, the qualifications or the prerequisites, have a deep understanding of EPC and EPCM contracts, and have all sorts of other different skills and expertise in managing litigation or front-end work. And I had none of those skills or qualities or experiences. However, the last line was, be prepared to travel. And I thought, well, that speaks to me. I'll give that one a go. And I did.
And on this circuitous journey to get us back to First Step Legal, you stayed with Caverna for several years.
Yes. So,
and working overseas.
Yes, it was a regional role as their legal counsel, and it started off in Melbourne, and within 6 months they moved me to Singapore, which was a wonderful opportunity for someone who was young and single to be relocated to an expat life in Singapore, which I did, and to have a regional role which required travel, lots of travel and at the time the company had offices in every Asian capital just about. So we had a Vietnam office, we had a Malaysia office, we had a Thai office, we had a couple of Indian offices, and would follow the projects and the project managers to help to secure the contracts and then to manage when things went wrong. It was an extraordinary experience, sort of capped with managing an ICC arbitration in Singapore for one of our Finnish companies in paper, and that was just an extraordinary opportunity, and it gave me exposure with not only managing complex arbitration litigation proceedings, but also working really closely with external legal assistants, and I did that, and it was just a fascinating time.
Speaking of fascinating times, you then move on to a marine salvage company. How did that job crop up for you?
Well, I met actually in a bar a rather eccentric German fellow when I was in Singapore. And this was at a time when actually the offices of the work that I was doing, there were some changes. The company had been bought out by another company and they were starting to close some of the offices.
This is at Caverna?
This is at Caverna in Asia. And then at the same time I was speaking to this quite eccentric German fellow who was talking to me and my partner at the time about having found a very old shipwreck. He was a sport diver and he had a company in Bavaria where he had an employer who was an Indonesian employee who had done some sport diving near the island where he came from, which was an island called Belitung. And in it he had thought that they found a shipwreck and he invited Tillman, who was the German fellow, to come and have a look at it, and they went diving, and what ended up being the oldest Chinese shipwreck was buried in the silty sand off Belitung. And when I spoke to this German fellow, he was at a point where they had had a marine excavation and a salvage of cargo. He had thought that he had acquired rights to the cargo from the government at the time. The cargo was being desalinated with the oversight of, experts from the German Museum. He'd had investment in the project, but the investor was sort of turning off the taps and was trying to pressurise a sale of the cargo in an auction situation, like, off the block of Christie's or Sotheby's. And he didn't want that to happen. He thought it was a time capsule because it was there was a story about this cargo that it was a gift from the Tang dynasty, 9th century AD, in China to Arabia, and it was a wedding gift. And there was just an extraordinary story about this cargo, and he wanted it to be kept as a time capsule and sold to a museum and preserved bit by bit, sold off an auction block, because there were some extraordinary pieces, 40,000 pieces, including gold and silver and bowls, ceramic bowls with different really quite ornate pictures and blue and white. So it was really, really an extraordinary cargo. And so myself and my partner at the time, we started to help a little bit.
Help legally?
Well, I started to help a little bit legally, but also effectively as commercial consultants to try to secure conversations with the government of Singapore at the time to see if they were interested in this and other potential investors and museums. We also were looking for funding to be able to give some time for this to happen, and we became involved in this project, and that was the beginning of another 3-year adventure that took me around the world a little bit, to Nelson in New Zealand, where there was the apple orchard where everything was being desalinated, and finally back to Singapore, where we fortuitously were able to be involved in the sale of this cargo to the government of Singapore, and it's currently, I think, still being exhibited in the Maritime Museum.
I'm amazed, Tania, that you ever came back to Australia. You've had such exotic experiences around the world. What got you back here?
Well, once that sale had taken place, and of course...
Sorry, can I just interrupt?
Yes.
You're maybe mid-30s at this stage, mid to late 30s?
I would have been mid-30s at this point, yes. And that sale ended. There was also a relationship that ended, and I came to Australia at that point thinking, I'm going to come back home. It's been a while that I've been away from home, and I was at a point where I thought, well, what do I do next? I also was a new mum and a single mum, and I wasn't sure what opportunities there were still in front of me, but I found another one.
And what was it?
And that was this time in crime, on the right side of crime. So criminal defence, I ended up David Grace, KC, who is unusual because he is a solicitor QC or KC. He has a practice in Queen Street, and I was able to very kindly gave me a job to work a couple of days a week with him and to support his work. Largely I did the magistrates' court work.
So can I say his work would be mainly county court and Supreme Court trials?
His work was predominantly county court trials, and also he did a number of Court of Appeal matters and High Court matters, so he does appellate jurisdiction significantly, and he also did some other work. But the bits that I could be of any use with, which were obviously limited, he's effectively he was able to provide me with a couple of days' work. I assisted him with the magistrate's court practice. He explained that he didn't have a lot of capacity to train and mentor me, but that was something that I could possibly do, and I assisted him again in preparing some of his matters for county court trial. But I became involved in criminal defence work, and I loved it.
Were you doing appearances in the magistrate's court?
Yes. I guess it was really through that I saw opportunities. But it was predominantly a plea practice, which I could manage in a couple of days a week that I was assisting him with. And people who, got caught up in the law, usually because there were drugs or there was other issues that I was assisting with. And I was doing pleas in the magistrate's court at that time.
You weren't a bit intimidated by it? I mean, most of us, when we first have to stand up in a court as inexperienced practitioners, feel a bit intimidated because everyone else seems to know what they're doing. But here am I standing up and having no idea. Did you have to get over that sort of feeling?
Yes. But I still always feel nerves whenever I stand up and speak, and I've done that a few times since then. I've sort of disclosed a little bit of a secret that it was unfortunately a few pleas in that I realised the Sentencing Act had anything to do with submissions that people were making, because I would listen at the back of the court, something that I think a lot of young people are not getting the same opportunities to do these days, and I would watch people in front of me. I made sure that I didn't go up to the front of the court and say I was ready until I'd watched a number of people before me, and I also got a sense of the mood of the magistrate. And I think, like anything, you do it a couple of times and you get over that sense of you can't do it. But I think the key part was just trying, giving things a go. And I guess that's been a theme in my life generally.
William and Lonsdale is brought to you by Green's List, one of the leading multidisciplinary barristers lists in Australia. Green's List believe in promoting conversation around the ideas and issues that shape not only our legal system, but our wider community.
You made the comment that you realised the magistrate's court was a bit of a sausage factory.
Yes.
What did you mean by that?
Well, I guess this is what led me to the work that I ended up doing at First Step, is that you saw those people who routinely and regularly get caught up in the criminal justice system, and you saw the particular demographic of those people. Really within a millisecond of being in the magistrate's court, you have a sense of it. And there was a report done a number of years ago by the Ombudsman, Deborah Glass, into prisons. And I think it was in 2015 that report was published. And in it, she paints a picture of the demographic of the people who routinely get caught in the criminal justice system. And they are people who, more than three quarters of men and women have a drug addiction or a substance addiction. About half of them have mental health issues, cognitive impairments. 35%, I think, were homeless. More than 50% were unemployed before they came in. And you can imagine that if they're unemployed before they come in, their prospects of employment when they leave or go through the criminal justice system or go through prison are far worse. Clearly, we have a shameful disproportion of our First Nations people who are involved in our criminal justice system. Something like 3% of our community is Indigenous, and yet more than 28% are in our prison system. So there's this extraordinary complexity. There's homelessness, there's comorbidity of whether it's mental health issues or cognitive impairments, and they're the people that are routinely caught in the criminal justice system, which is, I think you had at one point our former Attorney General as one of your guests on this podcast, and he once described our prisons as modern-day asylums.
Yeah, and that was Rob Hulls, yes.
Rob Hulls. So and that is the picture of people who come in, and we know that it's also an expensive prospect to have people in the criminal justice system and through the criminal justice system, but also throughout prisons. And then we're not doing very well as a result of it, because if you look at the recidivism rates of people who go to prison and come out, so people who leave, the recidivism rate is effectively what happens 2 years after they're in prison, and it's 43% go back within 2 years, which is not a great KPI. So for all of those reasons, my exposure to the magistrates' court criminal justice system really pushed me to try to think of what might be different and what could be better and what could be done better to have a more meaningful change.
And this takes us to 10 or 11 years ago when you started First Step Legal.
Yes.
So now let's learn more about First Step Legal. It's such an interesting concept. Can you give us a bit of detail? It's mental health, and it was before the legal element came into First Step Legal.
Yes.
It was mental health and addiction.
That's right.
A clinic in St Kilda for that.
Yes.
So can you take us from there, and how does it?
So the clinic started in about 2000, and the clinic was in response to the heroin epidemic at the time in St Kilda, and it was started by a fellow and his wife, Peter and Lindy White, who had their own personal story where their daughter had her own addiction issues, and they were not able to find a proper response in Melbourne for that. They ended up being able to travel interstate and had some support for that, and they had some means, they were able to wrap around supports for their daughter so that she was able to get through that and, continue to live a really great life, and which she has done. She's recovered completely. But they came back to Melbourne and they thought there is nothing here, and they set up First Step with themselves and a couple of GPs who really assisted people who were going through rapid detox from heroin at the time. And that's how the organisation started. But it has organically changed over time, so that from that modest beginning with some doctors and patients who were rapid detoxing effectively on mattresses on the ground, they had mental health clinicians that were able to work within that organisation, and psychologists ended up being able to work from First Step as well. And the legal service was started by my friend, Melissa Hardham, who now runs West Justice. And she started to work in that practice one day a week. And when I joined, it was also, a couple of lawyers, one day a week each, a very small practice dealing exclusively with criminal law matters. But it changed over time to what it is now, 10 years, 12 years later. Now it's a practice that manages criminal law work, family violence, family law infringements, debt-related matters and VCAT matters. And it is a specialist health justice partnership. So the difference with health justice partnerships and other legal practices is that the referral isn't from clients. The referral is through the health clinicians and who the client is engaging with.
So you, as lawyers in First Step, the legal part of First Step, your clients are referred to you by the medical team?
That's right.
I can't just walk off the street and engage a lawyer at First Step Legal.
Because it is through that collaboration of legal and health that the change is going to happen. Obviously, we have an individual relationship with a client. We engage the client then separately. There's confidentiality and privacy and other legal obligations that kick in. But the initial referral comes through the clinician. And the idea is that also that transfer of trust is affected. So most of the time, as I mentioned beforehand, people who have all sorts of challenges in their lives and who are more vulnerable and more marginalised are less likely to go to see a lawyer. But they might go to see a doctor, and they might disclose to the doctor some legal issue through that engagement, which is causing them stress, or maybe at the root of why their health is deteriorating. And if the lawyer is able to be engaged through that referral process, because they might not access it otherwise, they might not know how to find it otherwise, then or
they may not trust lawyers.
And they may not trust lawyers. But if your clinical support, if your therapeutic support, if your doctor says, Michael's okay, he might be able to have a chat to you about this matter, he's a lawyer that we've got working here as well, or we engage with him, why don't you have a chat to him about your legal issue? All of a sudden there's that transfer of trust that happens between the client and you from the doctor.
A very practical question now, which is raised by anyone who's run their own practice. How is it funded? I'm assuming that your clients, the patients of the medical side of the team, they haven't got independent funds to pay you, so it's all legally aided?
So it started off as purely pro bono, which meant that...
How did you live?
So I got funding for the legal service through private donations and through private philanthropy, effectively, to be able to run the legal service one day a week or 2 days a week. So it started off purely that way, and there was a core of philanthropic funders and donors who connected with what we were trying to do, which was to work in a very different way with the client to achieve a very different result, and in a way that was not funded through standard normal processes. So not through legal aid, and we were not funded as a community legal centre at the time. And that started in that way. Over time, we now have funding as a CLC to provide certain services. So whether it's through the family violence stream, through work that we're doing with perpetrator accountability work, with the mental health stream, but it is now funded both through as a community legal centre.
Who funds community legal? Is that state government? Yes.
Yeah, so it's both state and federal government funding that provides, through various streams and programs, funding for a community legal centre. And also so health justice partnerships you mentioned beforehand are not, is unusual, and it is unusual, and most people wouldn't understand what that was. But the Victorian Legal Services Board and Commissioner has a grants program every year. And around 2017, the grants manager at the time knew something about health justice partnerships. She had a medical clinical background and saw that there was a logic in combining services, multidisciplinary services, which now most people see as making such perfect sense. And we've had various reports and government reports since then, access to justice or integrated services, royal commissions, which look at more integrated services, multidisciplinary services being more effective. And she saw that. And so that funding round was opened for CLCs, for community legal centres, to apply for unusual, innovative health justice practices and partnership pilots. And we started in relation to that. We got some funding in relation to that for small projects and for small evaluations. And on the back of that, we were able to build an evidence base for more effective responses. And the reason why it's more effective is because you are working in a highly relational way with your clients and with a clinical team, and you're helping your clients to deal with the issues underlying their engagement with the criminal justice system, so that hopefully at the end of it, they're not going to represent into the criminal justice system, and they're going to have improved wellbeing as a result of it.
When you started, Tania, with First Step Legal, I think you said there was maybe you and one or two others.
Yes.
Has it grown?
It has grown. So now we have, I think, 11 people working at First Step Legal through 5 different health justice partnerships. So apart from from First Step Legal, we're also working with Star Health in a family violence program. We're working with Windana, which is a therapeutic community, a residential addiction-focused residential community in Maryknoll. We work with St Kilda Road Clinic, which is the outpatient of mental health program for Alfred Health. And we've also now started a housing partnership with Launch Housing in 2 different sites. So across 5 different sites, we have about 11 people part-time. Some are lawyers, some are other supports, and we have case managers and others who work in that sort of highly relational, collaborative way, intensely with people who, most of our clients have complexity. Most of our clients have addiction issues, mental health issues. Some have cognitive impairments, victims of family violence, other matters which, if they're not managed, if they're not engaged with, if they're not responded to, will not change and will likely result in further engagement in the legal system.
That makes sense. You've said that working in First Step Legal is the most satisfying work you have done, and its greatest gift is that it stopped the othering. What's the othering?
So it has been an extraordinary gift, but I think when I started, I sort of looked at effectively pathologising that I was somehow on one end and people with mental health issues or addiction issues were somewhere on another. I couldn't see myself in my clients and my clients in me. But this has been extraordinary work. I have, through being able to be a voice for my clients, for people who actually don't have a voice in most of their lives, I have been able to walk in their shoes a little bit and tell a story in a way that helps others, hopefully, to be able to look at their situation with compassion and empathy. But through that, I've learnt an enormous amount myself. I've learnt that through this experience, that but for some very fortuitous and fortunate aspects of my life, my circumstance could be very similar to theirs. And as a result of that, I guess it has helped me to appreciate so much more about my life, but also to understand the connection and interrelationship of people. We understand, I think, a lot more about trauma now than we ever did. But I understand trauma as not what happens to you necessarily, because they're sort of traumatic events. Your marriage has broken down, or you've lost someone close to you, or you've grown up with a horrendous background. But it's how you respond to that and how you and your body actually responds to these events in your life. And my clients, more than anything else, have an extraordinary resilience, because what is clear is most of the time in their childhood, at those really, really important and impressionable times in their lives, they haven't had their needs met and they've suffered terribly. And they've spent most of their life trying to survive that and anaesthetise themselves from the pain in relation to it. And I've understood a lot about addiction as a result of it, whether it's all the opiates that we know about, whether it's heroin or ketamine or cocaine, they're all painkillers. Alcohol, I think, was one of the first analgesias. So that's what my clients do, and I guess it's trying to escape from pain. They're not necessarily assisting themselves, they're causing themselves more pain. And I've been quite influenced by their stories to understand more about the human condition and what motivates and what might help to motivate change, which is really a fundamental precept of therapeutic jurisprudence, which is the founding kind of ideology of some of our specialist courts and the interventions that assist people who have those complexities. And I guess reading things like, Johann Hari, he talks about the fact that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, the opposite of addiction is connection. And this work has connected me with others that might have a very different life to me.
While you were doing all this work with First Step Legal, in your spare time, you decided to become a director of the Law Institute of Victoria.
Yes.
How did it come about? Why did you do it? What do you do with the LIV?
Well, it might not surprise you at this point in our conversation, Michael, but it was a little accidental. I had been practising as a criminal lawyer for a few years, and it largely plea practice in the magistrates' court. That was effectively what we did predominantly in First Step Legal and what I've been doing with David Grace. But I was not a fresh-faced law student at that point in that fairly junior level of the magistrates' court. And I really I thought it was probably a good idea to get some more experience or at least knowledge or education around what I was doing, because I was still at quite a junior level, but people would look at me and they would say I wasn't fresh-faced and I should potentially know more, and I didn't want to be in that position of not knowing what I felt I should know. So the LIV had a specialisation course for criminal law, and I got myself into that and I did that course, and it was really wonderful because it gave me a greater depth of knowledge about criminal law practice and some more expertise, and it also put me in contact with other people. But after that, I was speaking to someone from the LIV who was part of the specialisation board, and he had said to me, what you're doing at First Step is a pretty interesting thing, and you're dealing with people who have all sorts of problems in the legal system, and you have a very different perspective of the legal system, a different lens that you're looking at. That might be pretty interesting. You should think about joining LIV Council. He said, there's an election coming up, you should put your name in the ring for it, and it would be good to get your perspective about these things. And there's a lot of criminal law issues that we deal with, and I think you'd find it really interesting. And some of the reforms that you were trying to push, which I was at the time in terms of criminal justice and sentencing, it would be good to have your perspective. So I did. And at the time, the attention to detail was not perfect because I didn't realise I was joining the board. I thought it was council, which was like a committee. And I think it was my first board meeting that I realised, hang on, this is actually a board. It might have been when I was signing the deed.
Body.
Yes, the governing body of the organisation. But it was fascinating as well because joining our board at the time had 18 lawyers around the table dealing with the breadth of the profession and issues that relate to the breadth of the profession. So that's how I joined it, really.
And how has it progressed? What's your position there now?
Well, I'm currently the president, and I have been the president for 3 years, which is also extraordinary, and it hasn't happened beforehand. And part of the reason why I've been there for that long is not because I'm a reincarnation of Vladimir Putin, but because I've really been very, very much at the forefront of a reform and transformation of the Institute from what it was. And some of it has been by design and some of it has been timing, but effectively, the Law Institute has gone through extraordinary change over this period, and I've been very, very lucky to be at the forefront of it. That included a complete sort of management change of the organisation, bringing a new CEO in 2018, changing the location of the Law Institute from Bourke Street, where it used to be, to William Street, where it is now, selling the old building, setting up a new investment fund to manage the sale of that, a transformation in relation to the governance of the organisation. I think I mentioned to you that we had 18 lawyers around the table in the beginning. We went through an evolutionary change in the organisation to look at ourselves and say, are we the best governing mechanism for this organisation to respond to the profession now and in the future, with 18 lawyers around the table, and boldly and I think courageously the organisation accepted that they weren't. And we took ourselves and our membership on a bit of a journey where we changed a couple of years ago that board and governance. We've now halved the amount of member directors on the board. We brought in non-member directors. We have tenure for directors. There's, skills and capabilities that are very much, related to modern good governance and important for the board. And we've gone through quite a significant change of re-engagement with our membership in the way that we haven't beforehand. We've increased our membership in the way that we haven't, brought in a new PLT, a practical legal training offering for our members for young students who are just about to start their legal career. And so it's been quite an extraordinary change over this period.
You have non-lawyers on the board?
Yes, we have non-member
directors. And what disciplines do they come from?
So there's sort of broad engagement in companies that they have had an expertise in leading companies and managing companies over the years. We've got finance. We have someone who has a strong finance background. We have another person who's been involved in education for CPA, for chartered accountants and for CPA. So we've got an accounting capacity and also education modules to be able to do that. And we have someone who has general experience in running businesses in HR and also in governance.
So I'm a practitioner. I have my own practice in the city, in the suburbs somewhere. Why should I be a member of the Institute? It used to be compulsory.
Yes.
But it's not compulsory anymore. Why would I say, yes, I want to be a member, I'm going to pay my subscriptions each year? What am I going to get back? What's the Institute going to do for me?
Well, I guess that's the challenge of the Institute now and what we had to respond to, because, as you would imagine, we are a broad church because our members are not only the suburban or the regional, but they're also the criminal law practitioners. They're also those who work in larger law firms. And the Law Institute, what it does is it provides an offering that is bespoke and responds to the needs of each individual member, or tries to the best of its ability. Whether it is through practice support, we have an extraordinary ethics line, we have networking and ability to engage in the issues that are relevant to your practice through our sections and committees. There are about 2,500 members that work day in and day out on issues that are relevant for their practices through some of the committees and the sections that respond to submissions from government and also proactively provide submissions. There are a range of features about why someone would be a member. And there's also that collegiate aspect, that networking aspect, that being part of a profession which allows us to engage with others who understand what we're dealing with, can provide us with that support and make our professional life so much richer.
A long time ago, when I was a member of the Institute, I thought it seemed to be dwindling in relevance for me as I say, 20 years ago, or more than 20 years ago. Is it growing now? Is there a vibrancy about it? Are the numbers increasing?
Well, you're speaking to someone who would not be saying no, it's not. But even with that caveat, I would say it is. I think that's what the change has been over the last few years. That's to do with having an extraordinary CEO. I think it's having a different management team and other professionals, and to have a better relevance. But that question of relevance is really what prompted the governance reform. So we had no more of an ability to just expect that members would be members because they didn't have to anymore. So we had to be like a business in the business of membership, where we had to make sure that we were evolving and responding to the changes in our membership, what they need, and so that we continue to be relevant. And that is a continuing effort of the organisation. Our numbers have increased. The surveys that we get show the members are broadly happier with us than they were in the past. Having said that, in a membership organisation, you are going to have people who are happy with you and people who are not happy with you. And that's always the case. But I think that there is a significant difference in the organisation from when I started, both internally and externally. So both in terms of the feelings of the people who are working within the organisation and those that engage with it every day. And like most things, you don't know until you're involved in it what it is. And I wasn't very involved in the Law Institute in my life, which was mainly overseas. But since being a part of this organisation, I'm so proud of it. I'm so proud of what it's done and what it continues to do, how it continues to help and respond to the needs of our members and link our members with each other.
Lives in the Law is proudly sponsored by City Maps Illustrated. Their recent publication, The Melbourne Map, is a celebration of our wonderful city. This stunning, hand-drawn illustration, which took more than 3 years to create, is available as an art print, jigsaw puzzle and calendar. The perfect acquisition for your home, office or corporate gifting.
What about the Mental Health Tribunal? In your spare time, you're a member of the mental... Are you a junkie of joining organisations or something, Tania?
Oh dear.
You are.
I might say something about my personal life.
Mental Health Tribunal, what got you there?
Interestingly enough,
it does tie up with First Step Legal,
It does. And that is actually how it became. I was giving a talk at a conference about First Step Legal, and I think I was talking about some of my clients and their stories which had an impact. And one of the members of the audience came up to me afterwards, and he happened to be the president of the Mental Health Tribunal, and started to talk to me about the Mental Health Tribunal. And I was very interested in what they do because I hadn't heard about it beforehand. And as a result of it, when there was a call for applications a couple of years later, I put my name down to do that. And so the Mental Health Tribunal, a number of your listeners might know about it, but in this state, there is a body that makes decisions about compulsory mental health treatment. So this is the really pointy end of mental health high acuity in this state, but people who have complex mental health issues and who are unable to make decisions about themselves really effectively. So it's to do with, in circumstances where a psychiatrist, or there can be a psychiatrist application from a public health organisation, and the only basis in which compulsory treatment can be made in Victoria is if the Mental Health Tribunal make a decision in relation to that.
Can I just clarify?
Yeah.
And matters can only come before the Mental Health Tribunal if they're referred to it by a psychiatrist.
Yes. So essentially there are criteria for how compulsory treatment can be ordered in this country and given in this country and in this state. And as you would be completely aware, we should have choices in relation to what we do and what we don't do in a free and democratic society. And we certainly have choices in relation to our physical health. But there's an understanding that sometimes the reasons why we might not be making decisions that are protective of ourselves or others is because we have a mental illness that might be the reason why we're not recognising that we need to make those protective decisions, such as complying with treatment and complying with the recommendations of our medical practitioners. So in this state, if you have a mental illness as it's defined under law, and if you, as a result of that mental illness, need immediate treatment to prevent serious deterioration in your physical health or in your mental health, or to prevent you from causing harm to yourself or others, and if treatment can be provided, and there is what's called no less restrictive means if you're getting that treatment, then compulsory treatment can be ordered. And that both includes the medication, which is sometimes administered through a depot medication, through injections, and sometimes it's through compulsory ECT. And the decision-making body for all of those applications is the Mental Health Tribunal, which is done in a solution-focused hearing where there is a legal member, there is a psychiatrist member or a medical member, and there's a community member, and there's a hearing that's conducted where the patient is there, there's a report provided, medical practitioners also provide their views about the matter and they make the application. Family members can also express their views and decisions are made in relation to a time-based treatment order.
Tania, it's been quite an extraordinary journey that you have had from Mount Scopus as a child at school through to Monash, through to a lot of working overseas in a whole lot of different areas, back to the Melbourne law scene with David Grace and First Step Legal. Looking back on all of that, are there any lessons that you've learnt which you'd pass on to other people in the law, particularly students? I'm always thinking about students and young practitioners, but even experienced practitioners like yourself. Lessons you've drawn from your extensive journey?
Wow. I guess when I was in year 10 and following Ron Caston, the late Ron Caston, around for a day, I think I had no idea at the time, Michael, what an extraordinarily rich and interesting and fascinating career and life I could have with the law and with the practice of law, and how that it didn't necessarily follow a particular route and it wasn't going to be what I imagined it to be. And I think that of itself has taught me that you don't know what a life in this profession might be for you. You don't know what opportunities might be presented to you or where it might take you, but it promises to be, and it could very well be, and it has been for me in a way that I'm so, so very grateful. An extraordinary life and an extraordinary career so far. And I think that the key for young people is not to predetermine or expect too much, to be open to the opportunity, to keep trying, keep persevering, because what you think might be a dead end, like my life as a recruiter, is not necessarily a dead end. It's a door that closes maybe, but another one will open and you don't know what that one would be. Have faith that things will improve if it's not great at the moment. If you're not feeling inspired by the work that you do, be open to the opportunities that are in front of you and give it your best shot.
Tania, thank you. I have thoroughly enjoyed the fascinating journey that you have taken us on this morning, and I will watch with interest as that journey continues for you through the rest of your career. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
Show notes from today's episode can be found at greenslist.com.au/podcast. There you'll find links to things we've talked about in this episode, a transcript of the show, and some wonderful photos of our guests. If you're enjoying Lives in the Law, please tell your networks, subscribe, rate and review the show. Your host is former lawyer and Greens List clerk Michael Green. Our show is produced and edited by me, Catherine Green, mixed and mastered by Windmill Audio, and recorded by Alex McFarlane, who also wrote and performed all the music for the series. We're coming to you from the iconic Owen Dixon Chambers on the corner of William and Lonsdale Streets in our beautiful city of Melbourne. We acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respect to their elders past and present. There is no doubt that conversations about justice have been taking place on this land for thousands of years, and we are privileged to continue that discussion here today.